And we're really going to get into some of the really interesting parts of the book of Daniel. But before we do that, I want to ask you, do you remember what we studied in Daniel 7? What was the vision of Daniel 7 about? There were beasts in Daniel 7. Do you remember the beasts?
Leopards.
There was a leopard that had 4 wings, 4 heads. What else was there? A bear that was raised up on one side and had 3 ribs in his mouth. Very good. And there was a lion, a winged lion, which we know represents Babylon. And it was given a heart of man. And there was a great beast, right? A terrible, dreadful beast, a dragon. And out of the dragon came out 10 horns. And among the 10 horns came 1 little horn. Now, all of this is important because what we're going to study today is actually a continuation of this vision. This is part 2 of the vision that started in chapter 7. So let's go to our questions. And the first question says, Daniel's vision in chapter 8 is similar to which earlier vision that the prophet received? Verse 1 says, in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that appeared to me the first time. So Daniel specifies that the vision that happens in the 3rd year of Belshazzar. By the way, when did he receive the first vision? Anyone remember? It's the first verse of chapter 7. In the 1st year of Belshazzar. So it's been a couple years. He says the first vision, here's this other vision that I received after the first one. All right. So we'll see how they are connected. So the vision he had in chapter 7. Very good. Number 2, what 2 symbolic animals does Daniel describe in chapter 8? Let's go to verses 3 to 5. Then I lifted my eyes and saw, and there, standing beside the river, was a ram, which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high. But one was higher than the other. It's similar to Medo-Persia, right? But one was higher than the other. The higher one came up last. I saw that the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward, so that no animal could withstand him, nor was there any that could deliver from his hand. But he did according to his will and became great. So I already gave you a clue there, right? The one that came up last was higher, right? This is very similar to what beast in Daniel 7? The bear, right? The bear, the head was lifted up on one side. And as I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west, across the surface of the whole earth, without touching the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. By the way, I'm not sure that we're going to talk about this later. So, what does it mean that it did not touch the ground? Very fast, right? It was going so fast that it was almost flying. Right? It was as if it was flying. And in fact, the leopard in Daniel 7 had wings. So, the 2 symbolic animals are the ram and the male goat. Now, this is where we really need to take a pause and consider why we are being told this vision again. Actually, what we're not being told, and why we're being told about these 2 animals, these 2 beasts, these 2 kingdoms. What is missing thus far from Daniel 8 that we had in Daniel 7? There's something very notable that is missing. There's a beast that is not here, that should be here. Daniel 2 begins with this beast, right? Well, that's part of the statue. It begins with a beast that is Babylon, right? Daniel chapter 7. Why is Daniel chapter 7, why is Babylon not in this vision? It's gone, right? It's finished. It's the 3rd year of Belshazzar's reign. That means that Babylon is about to collapse. There's not going to be any more Neo-Babylonian Empire. So we no longer talk about this beast because it's already passed. Now, in the vision of Daniel chapter 7, what kind of animals did we see? What kind of beasts? There is a word that I'm looking for that all of these animals, we would call them today, a lion, a bear, a leopard, Predators, very good. They are predators, right? These are beasts that consume, right? Like I think the bear is called that consume much flesh, right? So these are predators. These are not what we would call clean animals. Now, in this vision, the animals are different. We just said that the ram is related to the bear, and the he-goat is related to the leopard. Why are we using different kinds of animals here in Daniel chapter 7? Any ideas?
Well, these are the sanctuary beasts.
So these are clean animals. They're sanctuary beasts. They're kind of animals that you would sacrifice in the sanctuary. You know, something else that is very interesting. You recall when we started the studies in Daniel, that Daniel was actually written in 2 different languages. One of them is Hebrew, and the other one is Aramaic. Aramaic, Imperial Aramaic, was the language of the Babylonian court. And it was also the language that was used by the Persians. This is the international lingua franca. So, the first chapter of Daniel is written in Hebrew, and then in the beginning of chapter 2, it switches over to Aramaic. Do you hazard to guess, where does it switch back to Hebrew? Daniel chapter 8 is when we come back to Hebrew. Now, there's been many explanations given for why this is the case. I personally believe that it has something to do with the people that were supposed to be reading the message. This vision of Daniel chapter 8 is not for an international audience. It's for those who are familiar with these animals, with the sanctuary service, and those that would know the significance of these animals in the sanctuary service. So, Daniel here, this vision is directed, focused towards the people of God. This is important. We're going to see that this comes up again. So, this vision is for the people of God, for the Jews, and it has to do with the sanctuary, because these are sanctuary animals. Okay, so what is the kingdom? What kingdom does the ram represent? I think we know that already. In fact, the angel is very kind to just tell us exactly what we already suspect. The ram which you saw having the 2 horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia. Very good. And what kingdom does the ram represent? Media and Persia. What is the male goat? What kingdom does the male goat represent? And the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. So, very straightforward, very clear. Okay, no possibility. This is the angel telling us the interpretation of this vision. Now, question 5 says, what does the large horn between his eyes describe? Again, this is so clearly given to us that we may understand that this prophecy is supposed to give us confidence on everything else that's going to happen. Because there is really no other way that you can interpret what you're about to read. The large horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Now, if you know your history, there is a very, very famous person that was the first king of the Hellenistic Empire. Alexander the Great. Now, everything that we've talked about so far concerning the male goat applies perfectly to Alexander's kingdom. Right? The fact that Alexander conquered the world, basically, completely ran and completely demolished the Medo-Persian Empire. He, in a period of about 10 years, he went all the way to India, from Greece to India, and he established a kingdom that was the largest that this part of the world had ever seen. So, Alexander the Great was definitely a great power. And listen to what we're about to be told about this. So, the first king of Greece, Alexander the Great. Therefore, the male goat grew very great. We know that. But when he became strong, the large horn was broken. And in place of it, 4 notable ones came up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Again, this could not be any more clear. If you know anything about history, you know that Alexander the Great died at the height of his power. Right? He was still young. He had just finished conquering the world. He was back in Babylon, and then he died at the height of his power. And what happened immediately after he died? His 4 generals Yes. In fact, if you go and Google the Diadochi, that's what they're called, the first and the second word of the Diadochi, there's going to be a lot of names. But the ones that came out victorious in the end were Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus. Seleucus actually came right after another one. So these are the Diadochi are the heirs of Alexander's empire. These generals are the four horns that arise after the horn is broken, after Alexander dies. And it says that they went in the four directions, right? The four wind directions: north, south, east, and west. Now, I try to look for an image here. Wikipedia had a file that would not fit in here, so I'll just tell you that towards the east you had Seleucus, right? Syria in the east, Persia. In the south you have Egypt, which was Ptolemy. In the north, which is sort of Asia Minor and Thrace, is Lysimachus. Greece was Cassander. And Lysimachus will not last very long, and eventually he'll go down to 3. All right, so how does Daniel describe the power which precedes Greece? And now we're getting into more material that we have read about in Daniel chapter 7. And out of them came a little horn which grew exceedingly great, toward the south, toward the east, toward the glorious land. And it grew to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host, and some of the stars to the ground, and trampled them. Okay, so the little horn makes an appearance again here. Now, this is where we really need to discuss the different interpretations of this chapter of Daniel. When it says that he came out of them, what is he talking about? Out of what? Is he talking about coming out of the horns? Is he talking about coming out of the winds? Because in Hebrew, you can actually make an argument for both. Now, people that want to argue that there is no prophecy in Daniel, they look at Daniel chapter 8 and they say, okay, this little horn, the little horn of Daniel 7, the little horn of Daniel 8, is a king called Antiochus Epiphanes IV. Antiochus Epiphanes was a real king, and he lived in about the year 200-something before Christ. And he is significant to history because he was one of the kings that had, he fought against the Maccabees, let's put it that way. He was very harsh towards the Jews, and there was a whole series of books and historical records that show that this was a king that was very bad for the Jews in this time period. So if you want to argue that the book of Daniel was written during this time period, the little horn is really great for you because it makes it seem like this could be precisely who you're looking for, right? If you don't want any prophecy, Antiochus Epiphanes would be a perfect candidate for the little horn. Now there is a problem about this. There's one big problem. Antiochus Epiphanes did not come out of the four horns, right? He was not a fifth horn. He was, because the text says that this was another horn. Antiochus Epiphanes was one of the four horns. He was a Seleucid emperor, a king. So he was one of those four divisions. He could not possibly be another king, right? He was one of the four kings. Now, in Hebrew, I told you that there's two ways that you can read this. You can say, okay, this little horn comes out of the four horns, or it comes out of the four winds. Which interpretation is correct? Well, if we were to go back to Daniel 7, you'll see that the beasts come out of the four winds, the four cardinal directions. Okay? And in the text that talks about the little horn coming out from the 10 horns of the beast, it very clearly says that he came out from among them. Right? So in that text, the Hebrew is very clear, the Aramaic is very clear that the little horn is coming out from among those 10 horns. In fact, he replaces 3 of those 10 horns. Here, we don't get any of that. It just says, out of them. So it would make at least equal sense to say that the fourth horn, the little horn, came out of one of the 4 winds, out of the west. By the way, there's a little bit more evidence here because you're going to see which direction this little horn goes. Okay, it says east and south and the glorious land. The glorious land is, of course, the Holy Land, the Canaan. So even if you were to argue that this was one of the 4 horns, you only have 2 options left, the north and the west. Now the little horn, whether you believe it came from the four horns or from the four winds, it makes perfect sense that it came from the west. So whichever interpretation you think fits best, it came from the west, right? Because the north, actually, as I told you, Lysimachus Empire, his kingdom can disappear right away. There's only three. So the only option left is west anyway. Now, what we are going to read about the little horn here is very, very similar from what we read in Daniel chapter 7. The things that the little horn does in Daniel chapter 7 are very similar to what it does in Daniel chapter 8. Verses 9 and 10 of Daniel 8 are describing Rome in its pagan face, trampling God's people. Now, we've been talking about papal Rome for a long time, but we forget that the first empire to persecute Christians was pagan Rome, right? They are, in fact, the ones that crucified Jesus. It began with pagan Rome, and then it transitioned to papal Rome. So, verses 9 and 10 are specifically talking about Rome, but in its pagan face. So, how does Daniel describe the power which was his Greece? It grew exceedingly great towards the south, the east, and towards the glorious land. So, by the way, there's a progression. I don't know if you can see it. There's a progression from the ram being great, the male goat being greater, and then here the little horn is exceedingly great. And this is the way it's described also in Daniel 7. The word exceedingly great are the way that the words are used. All right, how does the little horn power attempt to exalt himself? So we know that pagan Rome, this kingdom expanded geographically. It was a militaristic, expansionist empire. When pagan Rome fell, papal Rome arose. And it was a different kind of power. It was a religious, social-cultural power. He, the little horn, even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host. And by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. All right, so now we're getting into the sanctuary language. Okay, pay attention that there's a sanctuary language. If you're a Jew and you're reading this, you're like, okay, this has to do with the sanctuary, right? The daily sacrifices, the sanctuary is cast down. The prince of the host. Who is the prince of the host? The prince of the host is going to make an appearance again in Daniel 11. Now, who is the prince of the host? Jesus. And do you have any evidence from the Old Testament that this would be Jesus? Is there any stories, perhaps, in Joshua chapter 5, where Joshua is camping near Jericho, and they're about to conquer Jericho, and somebody comes to Joshua, a man with a sword, and he introduces himself as the commander of the Lord's hosts. That man, of course, was Jesus Christ before his incarnation. And here, the prince of the host is also Jesus. And this little horn is going to exalt himself as high as the prince of the host. So it's going to exalt himself in the position of Christ. It's going to take the daily sacrifices away from Christ, and is going to cast the sanctuary down. Here's a quote, not only the representative of Jesus Christ, but he is Jesus Christ himself, hidden under the veil of flesh. So, now, I don't know how Jesus feels about this, but this seems to be very blasphemous, right? That this man, this human being, would put himself in the place of Jesus Christ. Now, what about taking away the daily sacrifices? Casting down the sanctuary. Now, in Exodus 25a, we're told that the reason God tells the Israelites to build him a sanctuary is that he may dwell among them. This is actually a whole theme in the sanctuary. It's a whole theme in the Old Testament, that God is going to dwell. He's going to tabernacle among us. And when Jesus comes, that's exactly what John says in his gospel, right? The Word became flesh. He tabernacle among us. He dwell among us. Now, here is what the sanctuary looked like. This is the tabernacle in the desert. It was mobile, and here's another picture of it. Here's a bird's eye view. I think the notes here. Here's drone footage. So this is what it would have looked like if you remove the covering. All right. So let's talk a little bit about the sanctuary and what's inside of it. In the holy place, there were how many pieces of furniture? There were 3 pieces of furniture, right? The table of showbread. Across from it was the menorah, the 7 candlestick that had lamps that were always burning. And in between them, right next to the curtain that separated the holy place from the most holy place, was the altar of incense, where the priest was to burn incense every morning and every evening with the morning and evening sacrifices. So, in the most holy place, which is separated from the holy place with a special multicolored curtain, and inside there's really only one piece of furniture, and that is the Ark of the Covenant, also called the Ark of the Testimony. Now, inside of the Ark, there were 3 very important items. Does anyone recall, for extra credit, what are the 3 items inside the Ark? 10 Commandments, the 2 tables, tablets, Aaron's rod, and a pot of manna. Why these 3 items? What does this tell us about the Ark of the Covenant? These are symbols of what? Oh, yes, but of the covenant also, right? They're symbols of the covenant that God made with Israel. These are very important symbols of the covenant, especially the 10 Commandments, which God gave them as a covenant. So, the Ark was covered with a very intricately designed lid, gold lid, called the mercy seat. And there were 2 cherubim, golden cherubims on either end, on both ends. And the most holy place was only entered by the high priest during the Day of Atonement. And something special happened in that day. And we're going to talk more about the Day of Atonement. But keep in mind what is in the most holy place and what is in the holy place. So, the sanctuary service. What did you do in the sanctuary service? You brought a sacrifice to the altar of sacrifice, which was outside the holy place. And the priest would help you, well, you were to sacrifice the animal, and the priest will help you with putting the sacrificial animal on the altar. And there was a whole series of steps that followed after that. But I want to point out especially something that happened inside, here we go, inside the sanctuary. So after the animal was sacrificed and everything else happened outside the holy place, the priest was supposed to bring the blood of the sacrifice and sprinkle it inside the holy place. So if you committed a sin, you were supposed to bring your sacrifice, confess your sin, and then the way that your sin was symbolically paid for was with sacrifice of sin. Yes?
Confess your sin, or you can have the animal, and then you.
Or to cut the animals, sacrificing yourself. Right, so you put your hands, this was usually the head of the family, right? He would put his hands, and then the priest will take care of everything else, because you yourself were not allowed to go into the holy place. So, all these things, everything about the sacrificial system, about the table of showbread, the altar, all these things point to the story, the science of redemption. They point to Jesus, right? All these things were symbols of things that Jesus was going to do in order to save us. And we can spend a whole day, we can spend a whole week talking about each one of the symbols and how it was important for the Israelites to consider what they were doing when they were doing the sacrifices. Have you ever been to a children's science museum? I love children's science museums because you're learning science by looking at how it works, right? There's all kinds of contraptions, and it's not just pictures and text. Like, you actually manipulate things that show you how the science works. To me, the sanctuary is kind of like this. It's the same idea. God wanted to show people, the people of Israel, who did not read, most of them, who did not have books, he wanted to show them what the plan of salvation was like, to explain it to them in a way that they could really understand and experience it. So if you were to, walk through all the different steps, and you were to analyze what their significance is, you will get a very clear picture of what Jesus Christ was going to do for us when he came to die on the cross. And then after he sacrificed, there's also great significance in the sanctuary service. So, 1 John 2, verses 1 and 2 says, he, Jesus Christ, is the atoning sacrifice for our sins. And not only for ours, but also for the sins of the whole world. We have, Hebrews 8:1, we have such a great high priest who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven. A minister of the sanctuary, of the true tabernacle which the Lord erected and no man. A think we've studied this before, but the sanctuary on earth was shouldn't say a replica, it was like a earthly copy. It was an earthly copy of the sanctuary in heaven. Hebrews 9:11 says, "But Christ being come on high priest, by his own blood he entered in once into the holy place, having obtained eternal redemption for us." So, does this sound like the sanctuary service is over? If Jesus is the high priest and he is in the holy place, does this sound like we should forget about the sanctuary? It's finished, it's done. Jesus died on the cross. We don't need to read those passages anymore. Well, not according to Hebrews. There's a lot happening in heaven right now that Jesus is officiating as a high priest. And what Jesus is doing is important for us to understand. Now, what does this have to do with the little horn? Well, we know that papal Rome, over time, put themselves, like the Pope and the priest, put themselves in the place of this sacrificial system. Meaning, they became the intercessors between, not Jesus, but they themselves, the priest, is the intercessor between the people and God. And the way that we obtain salvation in this papal system is through the sacraments, by doing the good works of the sacraments. In fact, you can read more about it online if you want to learn how they understand how salvation is obtained, but there's definitely salvation by works involved, right? And the sacraments are a big part of it. And they're the Catholic sacraments. So, Christ left his priest to hold on earth his place of mediator between God and man. The priest holds the place of the Savior himself. He absolves from sin. Now, I don't know if you recall, but there was a time when Jesus says, "Your sins are forgiven," in order to heal the paralytic, right? And then the Jews were offended. They said, "This is blasphemy." Well, here you have an actual man, a priest, saying that he can forgive sins. Jesus Christ was God. He definitely can forgive sins, but a man cannot. So, clearly, the little horn of Daniel 8 represents Rome in both its pagan and its papal faces. There is no other power in history that meets all the identified characteristics in Daniel 7 and 8. Now, by the way, I'm not sure if we're going to talk about this or not, but why is it that you don't see the beast in Daniel 7, in Daniel 8, right? Because the little horn comes out of the beast. Why is the beast missing? Why do we go straight to the little horn? I told you that Daniel 8 is in Hebrew and is directed towards the people of God. For the people of God, whether it was papal Rome or pagan Rome, it didn't make a difference. You were still being persecuted. What pagan Rome and papal Rome did for the people of God, it ended up being the same. So it seems like the vision is given in sort of cutting out the whole thing about the political power of Rome and just saying, look, for the people of God, this is what it's going to look like. It's going to look just like it's one big little horn. The whole time it's going to be like a little horn, right? Everything the little horn does in Daniel chapter 7, if you're a follower of God, a follower of Jesus, that whole time period is going to be exactly like that. So, how high does the little horn power tend to exalt itself? As high as the prince of the host. Now, Paul is speaking about this. He says in 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 3, "Let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the falling away comes first, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God." Now, some people believe that sometime in the future, a nondescript person will come and fulfill this prophecy that Paul is talking about, that will fit this description. Now, we don't need to look for an undetermined time in the future. Already, there is an institution, right? Because papal power is an institution. There's an institution that fits these characteristics, exalting himself in the same place of God. Daniel 8:12 says, because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn, to oppose the daily sacrifices, and he cast truth down to the ground. He did all this and prospered. So, the Church of Rome cast down the truth by replacing Jesus, the place of Jesus, right? By instituting the sacraments as a source of salvation. The intercessory role of Christ was replaced by that of the priest. And we're going to see that people have also attempted to change the times and the laws and the way that we receive forgiveness. In fact, Martin Luther had a big problem with this particular part. So Rome, papal Rome, prospered, becoming the largest religious body on earth. The truth that was cast down will ultimately be restored. Now we know that restoration will ultimately happen when Jesus comes back. But there was a period after the end of the prophecy that we're going to study where the truth also succeeded. So, where is our high priest right now? Hebrews 9:24 says, for Christ has not entered the holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. So all of this, the reason we're talking about Hebrews, all of this is going to become important when we understand what Daniel 8:14 is talking about. So keep this in mind, that Christ is in the holy place in heaven, and that he is there right now, in the presence of God. So, where's Christ now? Where's the high priest? In heaven, in the presence of God. Very important. Whoops. Oh, apologies. Random crash event. This will open up in the same place. Nope. Still down here. All right. All right. Where is the true sanctuary now? Hebrews 8:1-2. Now, this is the main point of the things we're saying. We have such a high priest who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heavens, a minister of the sanctuary of the true tabernacle which the Lord erected, and no man, not man. So, Christ is in the sanctuary in heaven, ministering, doing something very important. So, God's sanctuary now is in heaven. The Bible talks about two sanctuaries. We already mentioned that. There's the earthly sanctuary, the tabernacle, the temple of Solomon, and the second temple. And then after that, we learn from Hebrews that there is another sanctuary, the original sanctuary, the heavenly sanctuary. And that's where Jesus is there. Now, every aspect of the sanctuary represents something about Jesus. As I said before, if you go and study every piece of furniture, every ritual, every ceremony, everything has a meaning, and it's related to the ministry of Jesus Christ. So, the scriptures testify of me, Jesus said. Christ lived a blameless and perfect life. He died for our sins once and for all. He rose from the dead and went up to heaven. And he is now our high priest who represents us. And he's our high priest, Paul says, because he can empathize with our struggles. He knows what it's like. He has experienced humanity. He has experienced temptation. What question is asked in Daniel 8:13? Then I heard a holy one speak. By the way, Daniel has seen a vision, right? He's seen all these things. And verse 13 says, then I heard. So this isn't something that Daniel is watching. He's not looking at this. He hears a holy one speaking. And another holy one, so there's two heavenly beings, and said to that certain one who was speaking, how long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of desolation, the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot? So the question is, how long will this Roman system, right, this papal and pagan Roman power, how long will it trample the work, will obscure the work of Christ in heaven? How long will this happen? So the question was, how long is the sanctuary going to be trampled? And the answer is given in Daniel 8:14, and this is very important. A lot of the time prophecies, I think all the time prophecies, eventually come back to this one right here. Daniel 8:14 says, "And he said to me, for 2,300 days, then this sanctuary shall be cleansed." 2,300 days. This is the time period. Now, what is included in this 2,300 days? This is the vision of Daniel 8. Okay, so we're not including Babylon, because this is Daniel 8. Beginning with the time of Medo-Persia, all the way until the sanctuary is cleansed. So the 2,300 days, the sanctuary will be cleansed. We have two things here that are important. We have a time period, the 2,300 days. We have a place, which is the heavenly sanctuary, and an event, the cleansing of the sanctuary. Which sanctuary will be cleansed after 2,300 days? The heavenly one, right? And we're going to see why it actually makes perfect sense. If you believe the interpretation that Gabriel gives regarding the kingdoms, the only possibility is that it's the heavenly sanctuary. Now, we've studied this before. The prophetic day is 1 day for a year. Okay, I think we've established that very clearly. So, if these are 2,300 years, and in Daniel, the vision of Daniel begins with Medo-Persia, this goes well beyond pagan Rome, right? It goes past Medo-Persia, past Greece, past pagan Rome, and well into what we would call the Middle Ages. So, the end, which is the cleansing of the sanctuary, this is the end of the 2,300 years, the end would have to happen a long time after Jesus' crucifixion. Because Jesus' crucifixion happened in the year 70 AD, 34 AD, and the destruction of the sanctuary, of the earthly sanctuary, happened in the year 70 AD. So by the time the sanctuary is cleansed, at the end of the 2,300 years, the earthly sanctuary had been destroyed for over 1,000 years. So this necessitates for us to understand that this sanctuary has to be the heavenly sanctuary, because the earthly sanctuary was long gone by the time the 2,300 years ends. All right, so there it is. It's the heavenly sanctuary that must be cleansed. Now, what about the cleansing of the heavenly sanctuary? What does that mean? What is the cleansing of the sanctuary? By the way, if you get this wrong, you might be greatly disappointed, as history shows. So, now let's talk about the sanctuary. There were two compartments in the sanctuary, right? There was the holy place and the most holy place. During the year, the sins of the people, or people brought their sacrifices, the sins of the people were recorded, if you want to call it that, in the holy place. How do we know this? Well, the priest would walk over and he would sprinkle the blood of the sacrifice on the floor of the holy place, indicating that the sins that had been committed and confessed were now paid for. And they were, in a spiritual sense, they were recorded in the holy place. And this happens every day of the year, right? There it is. Sins committed, sins confessed, sins paid for. Now, at the end of the ceremonial year, there was one day when the high priest went into the most holy place. And the work that he did on that day had to do not with the sins of the people, but with the cleansing of the sanctuary. What are you cleansing the sanctuary from? What is the cleansing? Is it a cleaning of cobwebs? No? The accumulated sins of the whole year, right, that are being recorded, that are being kept in the holy place during the Day of Atonement. In this special day, there was an atoning done that would cleanse all of the sin from the sanctuary, all the sin accumulated from the year. And this is why it was necessary for the high priest to walk into the most holy place, and now he was sprinkling the blood not on the floor, but on the mercy seat. Okay, directly on the mercy seat. This is how the cleansing of the sanctuary happened in the Day of Atonement. So, Leviticus 16:30 says, "For on that day the priest shall make atonement for you, to cleanse you, that you may be clean from all your sins before the Lord." So, on the Day of Atonement, two very important things happen. The sanctuary is cleansed, And the record, not the sins, but the record of the sins of the people are erased, right? The hearts of the people are, they have to prepare themselves for the Day of Atonement because this is the day when their sins are symbolically erased from history. So it's a cleansing of the sanctuary, but also the erasing of the record of all the sins. On the Day of Atonement, all Israel would recommit their life to God. Right? We can read about this, but they were supposed to examine themselves. They were supposed to confess any sins that they had. They were supposed to repent. And they were to pray earnestly that they would be cleansed and their sins be blotted out, which is precisely what happens on the Day of Atonement. So there was something that they were supposed to do. It wasn't just a high priest. Now, what is the significance for us? So we said that at the end of the 2,300 days, 100 years, the sanctuary in heaven will be cleansed. What does it mean for our high priest in heaven? We have a high priest in heaven in Jesus. What is Jesus going to do to cleanse the sanctuary in heaven? Let's think about this logically. If he was here on earth, he would have to do some movement. There would have to be a movement, right? From the holy place to the most holy place. And once he enters the most holy place, what is supposed to happen with the sins accumulated in the sanctuary? They're supposed to be erased, right? The accounts must be closed, in other words, right? There needs to be an auditing. Now, if you are going to erase the debt that somebody has, if you're going to close an account, what do you need to do? You need to make sure that the debt has been paid. Now, in the sanctuary language, how do we make sure that our debt has been paid? We need the blood of Christ, right? This is what the blood was sprinkled on the mercy seat. So, during the cleansing of the sanctuary in heaven, we recall this the hour of judgment, because this is when the final judgment is made concerning the fate of every human being. All the sins are to be blotted out permanently, and if you are covered by the cleansing blood of Jesus, then your sins are erased. They're gone. You don't have to worry about them anymore. It's finished. You are blameless before God. You have been covered by the sacrifice of Jesus. And this all happens in what we would call the judgment that happens when Christ enters the most holy place to cleanse the heavenly sanctuary. So, Christ is our high priest who knows and understands us. Jesus took our human nature, and because he knew what we experience, he knew our temptation, he was the only one that was qualified to carry out the judgment. Remember that Jesus says that the Father judges no one, he has given all judgment to the Son, and this is because the Son himself has experienced what we have experienced. Now, he was without sin, but nevertheless, the Bible tells us that he was tempted in every way that we are tempted. So, to what general period of time does the vision of the 2,300 years refer to? Daniel 8, 17, and 26. Understand, Son of Man, that the vision refers to the time of the end. And the vision of the evenings and mornings, which was told, is true. Therefore, seal up the vision, for it refers to many days in the future. So, from Daniel's perspective, it was far away in the future. Now, from our perspective, it's actually not the future anymore, but it is concerning the time of the end, which is the time that we're living in right now. So, it refers to the time of the end. The judgment happens at the time of the end, and it happens before Jesus returns. This is actually very logical when you understand when Jesus comes back. Is there some verse in Revelation that says everyone is going to go through, they're going to make a line and they're going to be judged one by one? This already has happened, right? The image of the judgment has already happened. If you go to Daniel chapter 7, the image of the judgment has already been completed. Jesus is coming for the reward, right? He says, I'm coming, I'm going to bring my reward. When he gets here, people are either going to be rewarded for being good or get their due reward for being bad. So that means that all judgment regarding their faith has already happened by the time Jesus arrives. The sealing also is important, right? There's a period of time where after the people of God are sealed, we studied this in Revelation, where the Bible says, whoever's Guilty, let it continue to be guilty still. Whoever is righteous, let it continue righteous still. It's been done. The judgment is finished. Let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them. What specific instruction did God give Moses to make him a sanctuary so that he could dwell among his people? In Revelation 21, it says that the sanctuary of God, the tabernacle of God, is with man, and he will be their God, they will be his people. So this is the promise. This is the promise from the beginning. This is the promise that we see in the sanctuary. That in the end, when all the judgments completed, when the sanctuary is cleansed, when Jesus comes back, we will dwell with God forever. Actually, he will dwell with us. He will come to our planet. He will come to our home and make it his home. And he will dwell with us forever. We will never be separated from God. For all these thousands of years, sin has separated us from our Creator. And God says, you know what? That was too long. You shall never be separated from me ever again. What is God's goal in this final day of atonement? This time of cleansing the sanctuary from sin. Hebrews 9, 22 and 23. And according to the law, almost all things are purified with blood. And without the shedding of blood, there's no remission. Well, no remission of sins. Therefore, it was necessary that the copies of the things in the heavens should be purified with these. But the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. What are the better sacrifices that he's talking about? The blood of Christ, right? In order to blot out our sins in the heavenly sanctuary, we need that better blood. We need the blood of Christ, of the Son of God. There is no other way for our sins to be paid for before the judgment is finished. God must pay, well, Jesus must pay the penalty of our sins in order for our sins to be completely erased. What is God's goal in this final day of atonement, this time of cleansing? To remove all sin from his kingdom. So, we're going to talk more about the 2,300 days. But the cleansing of the sanctuary is the purpose of this whole vision. Right? This is the reason Daniel becomes weak and he gets sick. He's like, oh man, this is stuff to do about the sanctuary. I want to know more about it. And you know what? We need to learn more about it. I believe that this is part of the message that God has asked us to preach, the present truth that we find in Revelation. What is Jesus doing in heaven right now? Is Jesus right now cleansing the sanctuary? Is he closing the accounts? Is he finishing? He better be, because he says, I'm coming soon. So the 2,300 days for us is finished. It's completed, that time period. We started it already, finished in 1798. And right now, Christ is finishing. He's closing all the accounts. He's getting ready to come and take us home. So we want to be ready. We want everyone to be ready. We want everyone to understand that this is what's happening in heaven. You know, Christ did not finish his work at the cross. He began his work at the cross because he's been working every day of his life since then to cleanse, well, to prepare us and after the end of the prophecy, to cleanse the sanctuary in heaven. So let's have a little more prayer before our break, and then we'll continue the next presentation. Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you so much because every time we open the scriptures, every time we study prophecy, we learn more and more about the amazing love that you've given us, that you have for us. I pray that as we continue to learn more about the book of Daniel, the prophecies of Daniel, that you will give us understanding, Lord, to make it relevant, to make it something that we can apply to our lives. This knowledge, this present truth, is something that we need to share with others. So help us, Lord, to understand it. Help us to believe it. And we may be able to share it with others, and they too may receive the salvation that Jesus is prepared for. In Jesus Christ, we pray.